All right. Hey, good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining the Plenipot 2018 Debrief, the role and impact of civil society. I'm Dustin Phillips, Executive Director of the Washington, D.C. chapter of the Internet Society, and we have a great event for you today. First, I just want to turn it over to our host here, Diplo, and I'll hand it over to Pavlina Idelson to say a few words.
So hello and welcome everybody. My name is Pavlina Idelson. I work with the newly established Diplo US. So this is our first event and we're very happy to have it with our longtime partners, ISOC and ISOC DC. And for now, it's only two of us. So my colleague Teresa will join us shortly. She's the executive director for now. So we're expanding and building on work of Diplo Foundation for the US audience. And one of our first endeavors will be a course in internet governance starting mid-February. And of course, if you want to find out more about the work, there's materials over there. And as I said, we're very happy to partner with ISOC DC and continue to work together. And now I'll hand the word over to Judith. Thank you.
Thanks so much. It's really always so great to partner with Diplo. I know ISOC has partnered with Diplo for so many years, from the IGF to other events, so it's always great to have a like-minded partner. Thanks so much for joining. Whether you're online or here in the room, I look forward to hearing from you. And we have someone who's monitoring the live stream chat, so that if you have questions, we would love to hear from you. And to get your questions and then get your participation and get your valuable ideas, because this thing can't be made without everyone participating. And especially as we'll hear from our participants, we need all voices to be heard, and so that they can also integrate your ideas into what what policies they're trying to do. So we start us on off is that for people who do not know about the ITU and the plenipotentiary, which is what we call Plenipot for short, every 4 years, the three different sectors within the ITU, that is the radio communications, the telecommunication standards, and the development sector, get together to set the priorities for the organization. And they also elect the top leadership posts, as well as other senior management in the different sectors. And that determines the trajectory of policy and standards development on issues that impact the future of the internet. So whether it's the radio communication standards, whether it's the working groups, or whether it's the technical standards, or what are the questions that the study groups in the development sector are going to look at. And so that's all determined at the Plenipot. The Plenipot is 3 weeks, and it's one of the most important events in the ITO calendar because of this issue, and also because it sets out the strategic plan for the next 4 years. And it also discusses what any changes to the Constitution, the Convention, and any resolution, which then feed into all the other different study groups. But unlike a lot of people I know here and others are very familiar with ICANN or the ITF and how participatory and how open they are to multi-stakeholders, the ITU, on the other hand, is closed. Private industry, technical institutions, and even like the regional internet registries or other organizations, they can participate, but they're non-voting sector members. The votes are only the countries themselves. And because of this, civil society finds it very difficult to make an impact. And it's also why it requires so much planning and strategy beforehand to have a meaningful presence. And Deborah, Mehwish and Deborah will talk about that in their presentations. And we will also hear from several other, the number of the civil society groups besides who were there, besides Deborah from Article 19, no, Mehwish from Article 19, Deborah from APC, we hear from Gus from Public Knowledge, and on my left, Jane Coffin from ISOC. I was also there as a part of an ISOC fellow sponsored by ISOC DC, but there were several other civil society groups who were part of the coalition who came there, and they played well. So some, as you saw on the head and the discussions on the listing, we'll try to look at several of these questions, such as what role should the ITU have in internet governance? How can we best explain and defend the open, inclusive, bottom-up model of internet governance? How do we protect the rights of privacy, human rights? How do we prevent the promotion of a restrictive online environment? And how do we work to limit surveillance of citizens? These are all very important questions that we hope to answer, whether it's today or another times. So the first order of speakers, Mehwish is going to go first. She will talk about how civil society first went about trying to make their voices known and push for wider participation and greater openness. Deborah will also talk about similar of those issues, but Mehwish as well learn. She's the one who really spearheaded the civil society efforts this year. And so after them, Gus will talk about the impact he was able to make by being part of the Argentine delegation. And some of the others were also part of different other delegations. We had people on the UK delegation, the Swedish delegation, the Ghana delegation, and the Nigeria delegation. So we had active civil society participants in all the countries that allowed for a multi-stakeholder participation. Now, the goal is to get more countries to allow for multi-stakeholder, and we'll work on that too. But that's sort of what we had here. And so I would like to then now turn it over to Mehwish Ansari, who really was the leader of our delegation of civil society and is one of the reasons why we were so strong and powerful this time. So Mehwish.
Thank you so much, Judith, and thanks to the hosts for having this event. I think I'd like to start by talking about how we decided to put together the coordination effort, and I really want to stress that this was the reason why it was so effective. Ultimately, was because every single individual, every single organization that participated in the coordination really had ownership over it. This wasn't just the effort of a single person or a single organization, and it wasn't a vanity project for any one kind of entity. And I think that ultimately it really came down to that factor in how we were able to work together so well. I think I want to talk a little bit about how we ended up setting up the effort, what the general structures of the coordination looked like, and then kind of go back into why it was effective before handing it back to you, Judith. I think really the foundations of our coordination were strong. Because those of us from civil society that are actively and regularly engaged in the ITU had already known each other, and we had worked together at various conferences and working group meetings throughout the ITU ecosystem. I think all of us, Jane, Gus, Deborah, and I had all worked together before Plenipot had even started. And so there was a really strong rapport. And we knew that we would have to work together on our objectives. So there was a shared understanding right off the bat. We knew that we needed to coordinate, and so that assumption was already there when we started planning and modeling our coordination effort. The really interesting thing about our effort was that when we tried to figure out the right model for how we wanted to coordinate, we ended up mapping our work based off of the way a member state delegation would prepare for PP18. And that was really useful that we had known. So there were a couple of key outputs that we wanted to achieve by the end of the process. And these were outputs that we had decided even before we'd had our first meeting. We had an value to completing these things. The first is that we wanted a minimum of 4 coordination meetings held before we even got to Dubai. And we originally planned to have them, to have one every 3 months in the lead up to November when Plenipot was held. 2 of them, we were lucky enough to have in-person meetings with the opportunity for remote participation, just by the nature of the conference structures beforehand. So we took advantage of the IGF that happened in Geneva in December of last year, and then in RightsCon in Toronto. We took advantage of the fact that many of the civil society organizations and people that were planning on going to PP18 would be at those events already, so that we could see each other and meet each other and build that rapport beforehand. And then in addition to those 2 physical meetings, we held 2 remote meetings. And being able to coordinate in person like that was critical, because we used that time to share information. One of the highest barriers to civil society participation at the ITU is the knowledge gap that we have to bridge. It's very difficult to get information out of what's happening in the ITU. That's of course part of the fact that participation is so difficult. So there are only a few of us that get to go in. I'm sorry, let me speak closer to the microphone. And so sharing information was key. And that was something that we were really able to privilege in our meetings. I think the second cornerstone of our coordination effort was the civil society brief that we provided. It was an internal document, but it was critical to mapping all of the different resolutions that were going to be discussed at Plenipot so that we didn't get lost in the shuffle. The third were a series of position papers that we worked on. I think understanding that the key to our coordination was seeing where we as a group found consensus on certain issues, and where we would then be able to capitalize and leverage that consensus where there was strength in numbers, essentially, and finding those positions beforehand. So we had key talking points, we had shared knowledge and shared language that we could work off of in the course of negotiations. And so we ended up coming up with a set of internal briefs that we used on specific issues. We had papers on privacy, on cybersecurity, on AI, ODTs, multi-stakeholderism. So it really ran the gamut in terms of the topics that were discussed. And fourth were very simply strong channels of communication. So we had a mailing list going early on so that we could collaborate, a platform for collaborating on documents, WhatsApp channels for use during PP18. And we really made sure that those communication structures were clear, so that, again, the key was continuing to share information. In terms of how we could do this differently for the next conference, I think we were good in sharing intelligence, but we didn't spend enough time sharing skills and information related to the logistics and peculiarities of negotiation in this particular decision-making process. Part of the reason why we weren't able to do that was because so much of our capacity was spent on creating these foundational structures for the coordination, these particular kinds of outputs. And so I'm really looking forward to building on this the next time around, when we continue, hopefully, to coordinate, particularly around the ITU. And so with that, I'll send it back to you, Judith.
Mehwish, thanks so. It's Judith again. Thanks so much for that great insight, and it's so true. So much of since this was our first time getting around, we spent so much time trying to get the strategy right and the coordination, educate people, but we fell short in some of the ways of negotiating, especially when people have not slept for days. And then it's a totally different strategy and how to make that work for you. So hopefully we'll get better at this, but I wanted to then give it over to Deborah, who had started doing this great work in 4 years ago in Busan at the last Plenipot, but it was a very different type of effort. And it wasn't as successful, but it was our starting point. So Deborah, I'm gonna move it over to you now.
Thanks also for those. I hope you can hear state.
Uh,
The differences between the
Deborah,
IT plenipotentiary meeting
you're-
in Busan.
Deborah, go ahead.
Okay, I hope you can hear me all okay. Yeah, so I was going to reflect a little bit on some of the differences I saw in terms of how the plenipotentiary meeting in 2014 in Busan, and some changes or some improvements that I saw in the last plenipotentiary meeting in Dubai. And thanks so much, Mehwish, coordinate, but really laying out the foundations and the efforts that were taken this time around. I think in some way, I wouldn't say we were less successful in Busan. I would just say the effort was a bit more ad hoc. The number of organizations that were here this year, including Article 19 and Public Knowledge, were present in Busan. It was just different people. So I think their institutional knowledge able to. The difference really was that we started coordination much earlier on in this plenipotentiary meeting. So we had the ability to do joint analysis of issues, to prepare briefs and work that allowed kind of a stronger foundation, as Mehwish said, around what we were to achieve. And I think part of that's also, of course, there's an information gap and the need to understand how the IT was more coming from the ITU this time around because of a new document policy that member states were by default publishing out password protection, though some were put behind password protection. But I have to say, going from Busan and from the Wicked conference in 2012, there was a lot more information coming, which definitely helped us. But aside from that, regular coordination meetings were quite useful. I think another big difference this time around was the array of issues that we were engaging on. In Busan, it was much more limited, playing a defense role issues. We had more people in Dubai this time around to spread ourselves a bit wider, engage on some issues that weren't being covered by the delegations that we could lead on. And so more numbers on the ground, which was helpful. I think also having the document set up, the platform set up, and communication channels made it easy for people to plug in later in the game. So if an organization or person didn't really have plans to attend until a few weeks ahead of the meeting, there was already a system set up that they could plug into. And that was really helpful because I think a lot of times we don't, as civil society, have funding confirmed, have our participation confirmed until the last minute. So there still is a huge learning curve when arriving and jumping right in. At least there was an infrastructure that could help kind of get them up to speed and orient or just support them, which I think was super useful. Another difference I saw was except society and their delegations, there were more delegations with civil society than in previous years. I saw that more so in Latin America. There was still a gap in Africa, though, as I think Judith said, the delegation from Ghana had civil society on with them, and there might have been maybe one or two others. But generally, it seemed like we didn't, in Busan, we were kind of all on European delegations or maybe the US delegation. So we weren't really getting information from other regional discussions. So that helped us get more information. Also, Ghana, that she was able to actually lead on some of the negotiations for the African group on her specific area of expertise. So it really allowed us to spread more widely and to influence in places that we wouldn't typically have reach, or we didn't previously have reach, I should say. And then, I mean, in terms of our ability to influence with a more coordinated approach, I would definitely echo what Mehwish said around negotiations and tactics. I think this is a learning process still, and the basic, most essential thing is to be there and to have information and to be able to coordinate, but then it's really about, do we have the right skills and ability to influence? And I think we're still working on that. I feel like in a few key moments society was able to influence, sort of push things in one direction. We were even able to get text into some. Politics are so much bigger than us, and it's always for me a learning process in different intergovernmental negotiations to get a sense of what the dynamics are, how we can influence. So I think the ITU is a specific case where we do need some more experience in terms of what kind of negotiation tactics to take on and how to approach the negotiations. I felt like we were most effective when we were on member state delegations as members of those delegations. I can talk about this more a bit later, but there's different ways that civil society was actually at the ITU. So some of us were on member state delegations as full members, some of us were observers, some of us were sector members participating as such, and there's different degrees of speaking rights and access to different conversations that allows. So I'd say where I saw civil society being most effective was as member states, which I think is kind of a funny position to be in, especially since we push for, having more open, independent civil society participation in these processes. So that's more of a bigger dilemma than can go into right now, I think. But that actually might be a good segue for, I think, Gus, who's next, who is on the Argentina delegation. I hope you're able to hear my stable, so I hope my main points got through. Thanks.
Yes, Gus is now up.
All right, thank you, Judith, for putting this together. Thank you, ISOC, as well. I think that what Mehwish and Deborah described is a very successful experience of engagement of civil society in a multilateral environment. I think this is beyond what the ITU represents. To me, like, to summarize key points, I think that it was fundamental, as Mehwish mentioned, that we spent 2 years or more preparing for this event, that we shared information, that we created mechanisms, we built. I think that we should not assume that because we're all civil society and because we generally are all good doers, we're gonna immediately trust each other. In these environments, you need to build the trust at the same time. I think institutional knowledge, institutional trust is important. Personal trust is also relevant, especially in when you know you're going to be at some point in like a tense political environment, like it is the Plenipot, as Judith mentioned, especially the last week when you are like very sleep deprived. So I think that was really, really good. I think that we should not minimize the fact that this also worked, because we were all humble enough to understand that it could only work if we were all on board and that we understood the value of working as a network. And I think that's something important. And that meant that I think that the fact that we shared information so horizontally and that we created so many documents to lower the entry cost for all the new participants came from this understanding of how things had to be in order for our participation to work. Going back to state delegations, I think that so in the previous life I used to work for a government, and so to me it's very obvious that if you want to be effective in a multilateral environment, especially in contrast with a multi-stakeholder environment, at least some part of the civil society community has to engage with governments and has to try to play the insider game. Not everyone has to play that game. It's not useful. I mean, it's not necessary. For some groups, it might be impossible. And that's fine. And that's a lot of value in that. But I think that it was, in this case, I think that a lot of the success was that we understood of the value of playing the insider game as well. And living with the compromises that implies. So for me, it was knowing that if I was going to be in the Argentinian delegation like I was, that meant that at some point, most of the time, representing a country and a government, not necessarily the position of my organization. And I was okay with handling the contradictions that can create and playing in the framework that situation creates. There are some things you cannot say. There are some positions that you have to tweak or that you need to adjust. But I think at the end of the day, it makes the voice of civil society more effective. I think that the fact that we have people in delegations playing a substantive role, like I think that it's rare. I think maybe she didn't mention it, but she was speaking in the name of the UK and the European delegation on issues related to privacy. That's very unusual. Deborah also managed to have to influence the position of the European delegation and Swiss delegation on community networks. That's also highly unusual. I managed to have a role in the Argentinian delegation, which is also highly unusual. I think that has to do with like constant work, preparing, and also using the opportunity, but understanding that that in multilateral environments, that's a necessary tool. So to me, that was a clear success, and also this was successful as well because we managed to have the trust again to share information on the ground, to coordinate strategies, and that the fact that we had shared information and that we went through the most important or the key contentious topics for us allow us to coordinate easier on the ground. To put it in other words, the fact that we went through an internal conversation of what we wanted to get out of like OTT, AI, cybersecurity, community networks, gender. The fact that we had these conversations before, not in Dubai, but like in person meetings and on email lists and drafting documents, meant that we then have to have them in Dubai when there was no time to do it. And that, to me, was also really important. So to sum it up, I think that it's a very good blueprint for future engagement of civil society in multilateral environments. And I think that there are many positive lessons to learn out of this experience and to use. And also, I think there are also like some negative lessons to learn and correct, as they were mentioned before. But I wanted to focus, at least in this first part, in the positive side.
Gus, thanks so much for that insight. And I think Gus hit on one of the important points of trust. As when you're going on a national delegation, trust is essential because they, as I will speak about, and as people, and as Samantha Dickinson has written about, there were many events happening, resolutions and discussions happening at the same time in many of the countries, whether it's a developed country or developing country, didn't have enough people to cover everything. And so without the trust built up, like as both Mehwish and Deborah and Gus were saying, without that trust, civil society wouldn't have been allowed to speak in the name of different delegations and do such an impactful work. And that trust that Gus talked about was essential because the Argentine delegation was extremely small. We did have a lot of civil society people on there, but it was also very small government-wise. And one thing that I don't think people understand is that while delegations may be very large the first week after the election, many of the senior people go home and the delegations shrink when the work doubles and triples. And so it's really hard to split one person or two people in 20 pieces. And so that is also what the impact is, that when they build up trust with different civil society groups, builds up trust with different governments, that they could toe the line or give out their thoughts and give them that. And countries are more willing to, okay, yes, you could cover this for me, or yes, you could speak in our name, or you could do this. And that's really where the impact of civil society can be held. So I want to turn this over to Jane, who had played two roles here in the sense that on the civil society group, Internet Society, Jane was the point person for Internet Society on the civil group, civil society group, as well as the point person on several other events in the actual delegation, whether the head of the delegation was Andrew Sullivan, and then the deputy was Elizabeth Olwach. But Jane was really the key person working on civil society. And so I'll turn it over to Jane.
Thank you, Judith, and thank you everyone for the organization of the event, to Diplo, to New America, the chapter here, and to the colleagues, particularly Mehwish from Article 19, Deborah from APC, and Gus from Public Knowledge, huge partners on the ground. I really liked what you said, Judith, about the number of delegates going down as the work ramps up. It's really bizarre that I've been doing this for at least 15 years. So this was my 6th plenipotentiary. And I have to say, I think I mentioned it to the team when we were on the ground, and I considered us a team. And I have to say that the civil society coordination, and thanks again to Mehwish and the others, Richard, who's not here, was exemplary. It was actually the way you need to work together to try and get something done. And it reminds me of what I used to see small delegations doing to effectively, sort of in an asymmetric way, work with against bigger delegations, where the small countries would get together, band together and work. And so I thought civil society at this plenipotentiary was extremely effective. And like Gus, I'm going to talk about the positive, and then we're going to admit something from a negative side later, because it's important when nonprofits find that maybe the impact that they were hoping to have we didn't achieve it. So stay tuned for the next thing I'm going to say. But right now I want to focus on the fact that it was exemplary as far as coordination. I believe Mehwish and the team are exactly right, that the next time we come together, we're going to be even more coordinated. What I would say is that while we were super coordinated on the ground, I think some of the governments need us more and more to help them coordinate prior to the Plenipot. And this is across the different regional groups, where I think we all have a lot of reach, and we can coordinate even more now in advance on different topics. And I think what the Internet Society will also do is commit to you to let you know when we're going to be at a meeting and where we need your help, because we can't do it alone. Everyone knows that. It's a partnership approach. And even more and more with the complicated issues, as Judith was saying, there's so many things that we have to prioritize them as the Internet Society. And we did go into the meeting prioritizing specific issues and knowing who we wanted to work with. And that was paramount with civil society and, of course, our technical community from the Internet side. But there's definitely more we can do, and strategically we have to work together on it. So I just want to say we're committed to that. We're committed to admitting that when we need to sort of reboot, and this is from an Internet Society side, not from Article 19, Public Knowledge, or from APC, it was really fabulous to work with everyone. And I have to say that I'm not sure I've seen this type of commitment in a long time to an issue. So we'll deal with the other issues later, but I just wanted to say that this is something that we're very strongly committed to, and we'll want to work with you more in the future. And just to target Judith's point about trust, something I've said when we're building technical infrastructure and communities to support that infrastructure is the importance of human trust networks. Building that architecture can often be 85 to 90% human engineering. So what we're seeing is a progressive work on our human engineering. So anyway, congratulations to the team for a good effort, and then we'll talk about what we can improve.
Jane, thanks so much for that briefing. And so, as you said, we had so many issues, whether they were online privacy, cybersecurity, gender, digital divide. They've all become significant flashpoints within the IT work agenda. And particularly as we focus on now on the Internet of Things, cybersecurity, and many of these have serious implications for the free and full participation of different civil society groups, and several. We had at this Plenipot, there were several new resolutions that sought to broaden the ITU scope. But at the same time, in broadening it, they also sought to limit the rights of civil society, whether it's the right to privacy, whether it's the fight against surveillance, whether it's how do we protect human rights, freedom of speech. Many of these new resolutions were trying to work on all those, destroy some of those or limit some of those. And it's if people are not familiar, is that different regional groups put in resolutions, or different states put in resolutions, and then there's work by the different regional groups to harmonize them. And it's this harmonization which takes a lot of the time, because the ITU needs to work on consensus only. So things cannot go forward if there's a disagreement. And that's the cause of many of the late night sessions, is that the resolutions could not move into a completed stage until they were there was consensus. So for this, although I had been on a Plenipot in 2014, I was there as a U.S. delegation member, and for this one, I was one of the 4 fellows attached to the ISOC delegation, and we had fellows from all the different regions. So one of our fellows was from the Middle East region, Nadir Al-Raj. Another fellow was from Africa region, Abdul Karim. Then we had one from Venezuela, and myself from the US. And we were very active in ISOC. As I'll talk about, there are 3 main working groups at Plenipot. You have the larger group is called the Working Group of Plenary, and it is in charge of certain resolutions. And then you have Working Group 5, Working Group 6, who are in charge of other ones. So if you look at the working group, and each resolution or decision or contribution is grouped under different themes. And the Working Group of the Plenary had 7 different specific, what are called ad hoc groups. So the working group, the chairperson assigns different people to lead these discussions and to arrive at consensus. And we had 7 of these, and then within those 7, we had 12 different additional informal groups. And then these groups sometimes broke into smaller groups, which we had 13. So you keep having small divisions in efforts to get people to work together. And because of so much of this meetings and these issues, and despite efforts to not have them be run against each other, it wasn't possible. And so many of these ran at the same time. And so it was difficult, as you say, to be in the same place, and especially difficult for smaller countries who are only who only had like 2 people and had to be at certain issues that there was their priority. I think as in the ISOC, I was assigned to cover resolutions concerning over the top, as well as connectivity and access, and the community networks, which is one of the main proponents of ISOC. I also followed the internet resolutions, which are grouped together as one. Basically, they're talking about, when they talk about internet resolutions, they're talking about 5 of them, which is 101, 102, 133, and 180. So all different facets, whether it is adoption and deployment of IPv6, whether it is working on IXPs, whether it's domain names, different other things, are all grouped under one. And then I was also working on the connectivity and access, were basically 3 resolutions that were bunched together and were trying to get consensus. Other of the fellows, Nadira, she focused on artificial intelligence. AK Abdul Karim, because he comes from a technical background, he was focusing on cybersecurity. Others were focusing on on Internet of Things, some more technical issues. Standardization, which is IETF, is part of them, so they're very focused on standardization issues. On over the top, several countries had put in many different proposals, and they are other countries who would not normally put in proposals, put in a proposal, basically so they could counter some more problematical issues, since you're harmonizing whoever has proposals in. So if you only have bad proposals, or not, I wouldn't say bad, if you only had proposals that were put in by certain countries that were harming some of the rights that you think you have and you wanted that are dear to you, and principles that are dear to you, you put in a counter proposal so that you could be at the table and that your ideas can be merged with others. And so that's why Europeans and others put it in. But tempers are very flayed in OTT. If we were able to go 3 weeks on this, we would have, but because of the chair having to leave a week early, it forced everyone to work harder in the very beginning weeks, which is one of the reasons we came to a resolution, an agreement on it, is that we wouldn't have come if we had to work 3 weeks, because people were then afraid. And even simple decisions as the title were heavily discussed. And many of these issues, they're looking at OTT, they are looking at expanding the remit. And so what we don't want is issues of technical standards or things that are services becoming part of resolutions, part of the work, because OTTs are really applications, they're not services. And so working to how we could figure out how we can hem these in more, and how we could promote compromise and showcase best practices and help other countries learn about that OTT is more about innovation, about competition, and how we can grow the economy through these new innovations. They're not something that needs to be taxed or standardized or something like that. So it's more of an understanding. And so we work very hard to keep these resolutions focused on capacity building, focused on learning about best practices. And I think that was one of the successful is that and one of the things I think that helped even OTT really start very early with our all-night sessions. We got it done only also because, one, the chairman of the plenary, the working group of the plenary, was an amazing woman who was not afraid to sit down with each group and give inspiring talks to each one of them, work with everyone, and try to get people together when tempers flayed. And this was especially true in OTT when the UK delegation thought that all was lost, and they just said, okay, we're just pulling out. And she worked hard to get the UK delegations like, okay, now I know we have some issues. I know we have can't we all just work together? And can't we all just try to figure out how we can agree on something? And without her forcefulness and her passion, and we wouldn't have, many of these would not have gotten to the floor, and it would not have been a success as we are. And that was also true with the community networks. She was really trying to get parties to be together. With the community networks, what it was on the community access, there were 3 resolutions. One, which was pretty easier to get done, focus on connectivity and broadband networks. But the 2 other ones, bridging the digital divide and community networks, were separate ones, but they ended up being merged together. And then for some reason that just community networks did not got overly politicized.
Yeah, I think I have something to say about that.
And Jane will also talk about that.
Should we talk about that?
It just, I think,
Yeah, I think we have some good. I just think there's some good strategic value we can take away. So maybe we don't want to go through all of the pieces of it,
right.
but I think the takeaway, perhaps I can help with after, when you wrap up. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jane. Yeah, so that is really, for me, I think, despite there being a number of community networks in many different countries, in Africa, Asia, in Kyrgyzstan, and all these other great things, and despite all that, countries seem to not really understand community networks. And or is that they were politicized, and agreements that had been made originally on resolution and on text were then the next day withdrawn. And this continued to happen. And in the last Plenipot, I did not see much of this happening, but this was happening so often in this Plenipot, and so many things got politicized that it was really, I think, troubling. And I guess what I found myself, having a passion for the connectivity and access, is the sharp divide that we all are looking for connectivity. We all are looking on how to bridge the divide. We've been working on this for 20 years, and we all trying to figure out how to do this. And to me, I would agree with, like others had said, that the fundamental principles are affordability, universal access, and looking at all tools that are available that can help countries bridge the gap in remote and rural areas. And to not even have these ideas recognized was sort of, I thought, took me back. And it became obvious to all who attended that there was a very stark divide between the Americas, Europe, Oceania, and a handful of other countries, and how to approach connectivity, how to approach internet issues, how to approach surveillance, how to approach gender issues, how to approach everything. It's this basic lack of consensus on core issues, I think, is one of the threats to the open internet, and we need to be on guard and work to build capacity and awareness to help others better understand the need to have an open and interoperable internet. So I think I will then close with that, and we could also open up the floor for questions and answers. And we're looking for everyone. We got a lot of questions in already, and I also have several questions that I would like to ask our different panelists. And I know Jane is really anxious to talk about, so I wanted to ask her, what does ISOC do? My question is, what does ISOC do when one of the main objectives for the Plenipot is not a success?
Okay, and thank you very much. And it's not that I'm super anxious to chat. I just wanted to make sure that community networks are one of our key priorities for the meeting. And I should back up and say that we do need to realize that this conference was largely about power, control, and money. We shouldn't kid ourselves that this was about development, because it wasn't. It wasn't about whether or not people care about civil society, because some of the governments there clearly don't. So I know that's a bit stark. Many do, however, and we had such fabulous civil society representatives on government delegations, and I want to say that that was one of the key issues with Deborah, Gus, and Mehwish. As the Internet Society, we have a lot of experience on our team, but we still had what I would say was, I don't want to use the word failure, but we did not have the impact we had hoped we would have. Perhaps it was a failure. So we had hoped that the resolution that came from the CTEL community, which is one of the 5 regional groups, would actually go through. Did we think it was Did we think the resolution would go through necessarily? No, we had a plan A, B, and C. We hoped the resolution would remain intact. Plan B was that we hoped paragraphs from the resolution would get merged in other resolutions. And then the last ditch effort would be Plan C, which was get the language about community networks, even a sentence in a resolution. That didn't happen. And this was not a failing of the team of people at the meeting or individual organizations. I think it was a failure of not looking far out in advance, and asking other government colleagues to coordinate across other governments and clearly identifying our WIP list. Who did we have in Africa? Who did we have in Latin America, Asia, North America, Europe that would support us and speak on the microphone? This is a lesson learned. It's something we're taking forward. We're looking to have a global summit on community networks next year, with many of you, we hope, and governments, because they're critical. They're making the rules, the regulations, the policies. They govern spectrum. They put out licenses. They put funds together. We as an organization can do only so much without our partners and without government. So lesson learned. This does not mean that going to a plenipotentiary isn't important, but it does mean that we're going to be seriously rethinking our engagement at the ITU and how we work with the ITU. ITU-D is for sure one of our critical places of engaging. But how do we do that? Doreen Bogdan is the new development sector director. She's a fabulous human. She's worked in the development sector and the ITU for over 16 years. She will be a great partner moving forward, as well as Mario, who's the new RTUR director. So the Americas did achieve an amazing amount as far as getting 2 new directors elected to the ITU slate of directors and senior officials. The critical thing going forward for us is to recognize that perhaps as the Internet Society, we didn't do enough. So we do need to expand our outreach. We've already been contacted by governments to ask for more. Work with them. And so I think this is a huge lesson learned for us, and we're admitting that. And so this was actually precipitated by a discussion internally about a development organization, nothing related to the Internet Society, but the group called Evidence Action. They just put out a blog 2 or 3 days ago about a program that they were administering and when they had to admit that the program wasn't working. So our community network program overall, I believe personally, as I'm part of that, not because I'm part of it, but it's working. We have community networks established. We have governments supporting them. We have Argentina yesterday just gave out a license to a new community network. Mexico's created a whole new licensing regime on community networks. And so the key thing for us is to look across our partnerships, where we expand our work with government and where we ask people to commit, because we do, you do have to ask. And what we didn't do is we didn't have that list of governments in hand that were going to speak up. And we had to coordinate better with CTEL, I think, in the future. So I'm just going to leave it there, but to say that, we were there to look at 5 key priorities, which were, as Judith had mentioned, IoT, OTT, internet issues, the inclusion, IG, internet governance related issues, and community networks. So we put that out to our community in advance. We said this was something we want to do. So community, we need your help because we actually need to do this better going forward. So there you go, mea culpa. Just wanted to put it out there. And any thoughts for a blog, let me know, because I'm going to be working on one to put this out to our global community and say, this is a call to action. We need to work across government, civil society, with all partners to try and do better.
I think that what Jane is just said also highlights how difficult it is to have a positive agenda in the ITU, but also in other multilateral environments. I think that considering that, at least in my opinion, the geopolitical context is not getting any better anytime soon, that's challenging, because it means investing a lot of energy without the possibility or the likely possibility of getting something positive out of the effort. And I think that's also something to keep in mind, that we should always keep looking for those opportunities, but also keep being realistic that sometimes the best we can get is like stopping bad things from happening, and that's very hard. and that's very difficult. And I think that's why it was so hard for many of us to see two key resolutions on community networks dying at the Plenipot, because I think at some point we're expecting that to be our positive victory. And when it's not, it's like you end up with just like having negative victories, and that's very discouraging. That also makes you feel like you're not contributing to the organization, because at the end of the day, victories in these institutions are measured in how many new things the plenary or the assembly gets, and those were not victories for us. So that makes it very very hard. But I also think it shows that perhaps regional work should be emphasized over global work. I think that there's without neglecting global work, but there's more common ground at the regional level, especially in the Americas, than at the global. And I think maybe we should try to find ways to move forward with that.
There's also one other thing I would say is that it's really a bit shocking when you realize that something that is good as a community network, bottom up, community built, led, managed networks to connect the unconnected, was attacked. And clearly what happens, as Judith had said earlier, is that there are political issues and you don't want to be in the top 5. This landed in the top 5 to 6 and became what I called the piñata, or the beach ball in the room. They kept using it to get what they wanted on cyber, which was their ultimate objective, and internet and some other issues. And so to Gus's point, if we can work more in the regions, we have something here. I mean, this isn't as though this is a mistake. Community networks are incredibly powerful. They empower people. They, in addition to connecting them. And it was shocking to me to think, gosh, I've been doing this for 15 to 20 years. And part of the agenda is to connect people. And if people are still unconnected, then we all have a responsibility to connect them. So, what's up here? And so I think it's key that we do it. Gus, I really like what you're saying. And so I think we'll have to redouble our efforts and try even harder, because they're afraid of us. And there is power in what civil society did at that meeting. So please don't take away that there wasn't, because people listened when Mehwish was on the microphone, when Gus was on the microphone, and when Deborah was on the microphone. That was huge. As ISOC, I used to work for the US government. I used to be on the microphone all the time. I could barely speak. And that was so weird for me, obviously. But I was able to speak in one meeting, and my colleague Christian O'Flaherty from Argentina was with me, and we said, we got to be really strategic about what we say, because you can't take on a government. Even though you'd love to just say what you just said is untrue, what we had to say was provide technical neutral information, because we want people to see civil society and the technical community, ICANN, the RARs, IETF if they're there, and others, as trusted go-tos, right? We're trusted experts. We're not going to come in and try and flip the situation. We want to come out of the situation with something practical that we can take away. And so now we have to think harder on what to do.
Yeah, and also like something else I think is important is that the fact that we have organizations, civil society that are truly global, not only ISOC, but also APC and Article, that actually have people on the ground in many other places all around the world. It's an asset that we should leverage more than what we did, because that gives you capillarity, a capacity to understand the cultural sensitivity to actually advance your positions, that also Access has a global presence that we should definitely use, because that means that we can approach governments from different places. That's also something that I think is critical, that in multilateral environments, there are like two actors that are actually transnational companies, and they do that all the time. So if you pay attention, like Facebook people or Google people, they have their own public policy people, like engaging with the national governments wherever they are, shaping the same position. And civil society, I think if civil society understands that's a huge advantage, because you can approach governments with the same message, adjusted to make it more appealing, at the same time coordinating positions. That's huge, because governments don't have that. So governments have the vote, but they don't have that capacity to communicate directly with governments at the local level, because they don't have that capability. So that's something huge that we should use more.
Thanks so much, Gus. Now that also brings it to the question is, how can civil society be effective in a multilateral environment? And I'll go to you for that. You wrote it.
Oh, the first one?
Or did we, is there any?
We do. We have some questions. But
Yeah.
But
Do
this
Mehwish
is.
or want to add to what Gus and I just?
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So why don't we just ask Mehwish and Deborah if you could add to what Jane and Gus were saying?
Thanks. This is Deborah. I can jump in on the community networks discussion. Also, from APC's side, going in community networks was a priority for us, and so I would definitely echo the feeling of disappointment, if not failure, around this. Not only because it was a priority, but because it's so clearly in the mandate and priority of the ITU to connect the unconnected, and sitting in negotiations about everything from trafficking in persons to AI to all sorts of things that are very tangentially related to the ITU. It felt quite surreal that something as basic and very positive as community networks was shot down. And so I think, just to echo a few things Jane said, it wasn't ignored. It wasn't something that was just like looked over. It was contentious to the highest level and was being negotiated by some of the most prominent people at in some of the meetings. So I think we have to realize the significance of it, that there's definitely there's power dynamics at play, and that I think kind of a broader point is that we often focus on, the substance of our arguments, making the case for it, why at a substantive level, why community networks or other issues should be either promoted or shut down in the case of other issues. But I don't think we focus enough on tactics. And I wasn't in the WTDC, the World Telecommunication Development Conference in Argentina the year before, but I know others were. And I know a similar scenario played out. So I think what we need to do a better job of as civil society and allies is to better debrief, to sort of understand why what happened. And I think I completely agree on using the regional prep meetings and our reaches in different countries and regions better. But I think we had different strategies within civil society, and having really frank and open conversations about why we think a particular strategy is right or wrong is super important. And we kind of get stuck on, is this the right text? How do we argue for the text rather than how do we make sure that the different players are lined up and ready to speak, and when to speak, when is most strategic. So I think there's definitely a lot of learning to do on that. And I see a lot of goodwill and I think the fight and the fact that it went down as it did got a lot of people riled up and excited about it. So that's something to look forward to moving forward. And then just to also bounce off Jane's point about the power dynamics, I think one thing we could do a better job of is seeing kind of beyond the ITU, how things are playing out. I live in New York and follow some of the developments at the UN General Assembly. While we're negotiating on cybersecurity in Plenipot, in the first committee of the GA, there was a cybersecurity resolution, 2 competing ones from the US and Russia playing out. And the way those played out in New York very much influenced what happened in Dubai. And so when the Russian Federation's resolution passed in New York, some things opened up and they weren't pushing as hard in Dubai, and the Russians said that themselves. So I think we also need to keep a broader eye on what's going on outside the ITU. And while we need to be standing on strong ground on substance and be able to argue from that point of view, I'm not saying we're naive, but I think we need to get one step further and be able to be more tactical about how to approach negotiations. So I'll stop there, and I think, I don't know if Mehwish wants to also jump in on that.
Yes. Thanks so much, Deborah. Mehwish, do you have anything? Do you want to jump in? So we also have some audience questions, which we'll get to, but we wanted to give you a chance.
Thanks, Judith, and thanks, Deborah. Just to echo a couple of points that were made by Deborah in terms of being tactical and being, I think, more clear-eyed. I really think that Deborah is completely right about the fact that, and moving forward, this is something that we should do, that we should fold into our coordination, is not just looking at what our positions are and what the text is, but to see it as a political environment and to understand how text can become politicized in ways that go beyond our control. We've been talking a lot about community networks, and I think that is a key example, and the one of the prime takeaways that we should have from this conference. But something, the gender resolution, the discussions on Resolution 70, which I was in those discussions with Deborah. It was also highly politicized, where the resolution, the negotiations were essentially held hostage so that certain governments could make a bigger play, could negotiate other pieces in other resolutions that were happening. And because they saw that the resolution on mainstreaming a gender perspective and the gains that we had made in our informal discussions were important to certain governments, that could be used as a political football. That's not, I mean, if you were at the development conference that Deborah mentioned the year before, you would have felt a sense of deja vu, because it's the exact same thing that happened with the ITUD resolution on gender mainstreaming for that conference in Buenos Aires. And so it goes to being clear about when issues become politicized and how to deal with that, how to be political as well, because these issues are really important to us, particularly from civil society perspective. We're quite passionate about them, and to kind of move out of that and be a little more sanguine to play a political game can be difficult. It's not something that comes naturally to the stakeholder group and to a lot of us within this sector, but I think it goes back to strategy development and skills development when it comes to, as Deborah says, and as Jane said, building our tactics, being a bit savvier as in negotiating within what is very clearly a political environment.
Thank you so much, Mehwish. We have received some audience questions already, but if you haven't sent your question in, please do. So the first question is, did civil society groups from the Global South have a voice at the Plenipot? Also, did Global South and Global North civil society organizations network successfully at the Plenipot? And I'll turn first to Gus to answer that.
I think that there were groups from the Global South and people from the Global South that managed to have an influence in the Plenipot. I think we had groups from Chile, from Mexico, from some African countries that participated in either national delegations or as members influencing the national delegations. So I think that happened. Also, I think from Brazil, there were several civil society groups in the Brazilian delegation. I would also add that another way to influencing these processes is keeping in mind that at the end of the day, only governments have a vote. Engaging with your national government and your national delegation before the event and letting them know what are your priorities and at the very least, letting them know that you're keeping an eye on what they are doing is also a way of influencing their positions. In fact, we saw it clearly how the Chilean delegation that only joined the last week, because there were Chilean groups that were following the debate, they managed to communicate how they perceive the debates had been going in the previous weeks before the Chilean delegation arrived in Dubai. And I think that shaped the position of that delegation, and I think that's important. So yes, of course, there's always room for improvement, but I think also as we were talking about earlier, I think it's important to remember that in America's case, in Argentina, in Brazil, and in Mexico, there were civil society people in the delegations as integral parts, and that's something huge, and that's something we should build upon that. The same, and we should do more of that in Africa and in Asia. But we were in a good place, I think.
Thanks so much, Gus. Jane, do you have any? Mehwish or Deborah, do you want to chime in on this question?
Just a quick point. This is Deborah. APC is a sector member of the ITU, so we're able to accredit civil society to attend the Plenipot. So We accredited a few groups from the Global South who weren't able to get on their national delegations for various reasons. And then the Swedish delegation accepts civil society from different countries. So they also accredited Tunisian civil society as well as Kenyan. I think it is more difficult if you're not on your national delegation to influence debates, but sometimes just having the opportunity to be in location and talk to your delegation can be useful. And colleagues in South Africa from APC were in touch with the national prep meeting. So I think there's definitely room for more engagement, especially in the African region. I think Ghana was the only country with civil society in the delegation in Dubai, but there's some progress being made. And I would say that the cooperation between global North and South, so to speak, was quite strong. And I hope that our colleagues in other countries feel the same way. Thanks.
We should just also say that the team on the ISOC delegation, Judith, clearly from the United States, but the team from Palestine, Nadira, is civil society, Venezuela is civil society, and our colleague from, was technical, but he's also from the civil society aspect. He does work in ICANN, so from Nigeria. So that was on the ISOC Del, and I would just say that APC did a great job making sure there were people accredited. So thank you for that. We're a sector member too, but we couldn't accredit others because we're trying to contain the numbers of our delegation.
I wanted to add another thing, which is that it is, in order to be part of the national delegation, is critical to engage early on with your national government. Like, it won't happen if the week before Plenipot you're like, oh, can I come? The answer is going to be no.
Yeah, so this is Judith again. And in relation to that, there were also a couple of civil society in the US who wanted to come onto the US DEL, but the US DEL starts mobilizing very early. And so by March, even though the conference was not until October, they were closed to new people. And so while some other delegations have different times when they close, some of the large ones close early, and then US would admit as many as they can, but as long as they apply early, because one of the things that the national delegation works on is how can we work and get our voice heard. And with some, the voice is being heard with how do you work within your regional groups, and the regional groups close earlier. So most of the work is done earlier. With the US, one of the things I think I saw that was great this time was the success of CTEL. CTEL is the Americas regional organization, and it consists of US and everyone in the Americas. So US, Canada, Mexico, and everyone, Latin America, South America. But I think this time, what was really great was how unified CTEL was. In the past, there were other countries who would say, who would not talk as a bloc, or they would have their own resolution, but it was extremely unified, and there was very much of a large effort played to get everyone on the same page, to get all disagreements to be worked out in advance so that they could put on a united front, and you are stronger together than when you are apart. So one of the criticisms of things were like, oh, it's only to develop. But what's extremely important is to show that, no, there's a lot of developing countries within CTEL who are saying this is the same thing. You can't, I am developing. You cannot tell me I can't, that my thoughts are only for developed countries. And I think speaking for one voice is very important in that. And I wanted to get, there was another question from the audience that said about whether they think it's better for civil society to be within the government delegation or be on the ground as a sector member. And that differs, but I'll let Gus.
Maybe we can start.
Oh, Mehwish, but why don't you start with this one, since you're on the UK delegation?
Sure. Thanks, Judith. I think the ITU exemplifies a question that we as civil society ask ourselves a lot. Even as we call for structural change, to what extent is it necessary to participate and therefore validate that same structure? And I think that goes back to the fact that, the ITU is a multilateral body, as we've been discussing, and as it increases its focus on internet-related technical and policy matters, there's a general pushback from civil society representatives that advocate for multi-stakeholder decision-making when it comes to the internet. And at the same time, I think we as civil society generally see ourselves as the countervailing force that holds government accountable to the public interest. So it's easy to see how some within civil society would balk at the idea of joining government delegations because, to some it might feel like selling out. But I think echoing what Gus and Deborah, Judith, and Jane have all said is that, even as we continue to advocate for opening up the space for more meaningful multi-stakeholder decision-making, one that includes civil society, as Deborah was saying, the most effective way we can participate in the ITU is through government delegations. The level of access we have to closed-door meetings, the ability we have to actually speak and lead on issues on behalf of the delegation, as Gus mentioned, we simply cannot be effective without it, without at least having some members of civil society on those delegations. Saying that, I realize that in saying that, I come with a certain level of privilege. And we need to recognize that not all civil society organizations are in the same positions and are working within the same political contexts. It's not feasible or possible for all civil society organizations to speak to their government representatives, to open themselves up to join those delegations. But that fact should only drive us to continue fighting for that structural change when we actually can make it through the door. And just a final thought on I know I'm keeping this fairly high level, but just to answer the question, just a final thought on the value of working within national delegations. I think we tend to see it as a means to an end when we talk about it. The national delegation is just a conduit for us to be able to get our foot in the door, to get into the discussions, to participate. However, there is a real strategic value to building long-term relationships with the individuals in your national delegation. At the end, this is just about people connecting with other people, and we're just trying to make those relationships stronger. And as you begin to work on issues, it's a chance to really influence the delegation's positions on these issues. So it's not just somehow where insurgently taking on the mic and somehow duping national governments into allowing us to take these positions. It's actually having the chance to get to talk to these individuals and see where we truly have consensus, where we can actually build stronger, more rights respecting positions. So, in that sense, if the goal for us is to influence the member states of the ITU towards more rights respecting consensuses, that doesn't just have to happen in the corridors of the conference hall. That also happens in the gentle nudges you keep sending your other colleagues on the delegation before, during, and after the conference, saying, maybe you should take a position on this, or, I think we can go further on this, on that language. That also brings meaningful, more sustainable, more long-lasting change.
Mehwish, thanks so much for that great answer. Just wanted to give Deborah a chance, if she wants it, to also contribute.
Thanks, Judith. And yeah, I think that's a really important question, and one we grappled with at APC because we did have the opportunity to attend as a sector member. But in the end, I ended up joining the Swedish delegation as an observer, which is in a way kind of a midway point between being a full member of the delegation and being an outsider. And the reason we ended up joining was because we felt that the information flow, the kinds of conversations that you have access to on a delegation is very different than what you do as a sector member. And then the ability to, as a member state, take a floor, or which I didn't really have access to as an observer, but to be able to directly influence the positions of a delegation was strategic for us. So even in the first conversation, the first day, I realized that my delegation didn't have a position on one of the issues that APC prioritized. So just by virtue of being on the delegation, we were able to influence and help shape that position. That's not to say there isn't value in attending as a sector member. And I don't think it's an either or, I think it's both. And in order to actually open up the ITU to being more open to civil society, to allow for our participation more later on, we actually need to be on the delegations and being privy to and influencing those discussions in order to open up the space. So I think, and just to add to that, I feel that with the question of civil society participation at the ITU, it's a bit of a learning curve. I remember back in the Wicket, it was very close to civil society, and there was a lot of media, a lot of coverage kind of with civil society criticizing what was happening at the ITU, and kind of a harsh reaction from the ITU itself. And I think they're just not very familiar with how civil society works and operates, and the values that we can contribute to their conversations and expertise that we can help improve their work. So by being part of the conversations, even within delegations, I think there is a delegitimizing factor in the sense that we're kind of saying, or legitimizing factor, that we're giving legitimacy by participating but not having our own space to participate. But on the other hand, we're also helping them understand the value of civil society so that they'll be more open to us moving forward. So I think it's a delicate balance, and I wouldn't say it's either or, that we need both people inside and outside.
Thanks so much for that, Gus. Okay, thanks so much for that great analysis. What? Oh, does anyone in the room have another question? Otherwise, we'll go with one of the other audience questions that are asked in the live stream. Okay, so we will also have a question as it was asked, what will be done, what will civil society do in the ITU as a result of Plenipot 18 that they weren't done prior to that? So what changes do you see happening in the future that you learned from Plenipot 18, or that you prepared prior to it but then never got implemented, or you thought, oh, I should have done it this way? And so I'll just put it out. Jane, do you?
I'll just say very briefly that I would go back to a point that I think Mehwish or Deborah had mentioned earlier and Gus touched upon, is that we could do some training with civil society colleagues in the regions, both strategic and tactical, political. The ITU is a political animal. It's governments. They sign the treaties. We don't. And so that's just a realization we have to have, and to figure out how we can have that impact. And for us as an organization, it's even more coordination with our colleagues, with colleagues around the world, civil society, technical community. We're part of both, but we need to figure out, what we can do to bring civil society to this global summit we're going to have, and what role you can play, and how to amplify messaging that's important to civil society while we're looking at a sort of a meta objective of X connectivity type of thing. In any event, no, we have a lot of lessons learned from this, and also just to work with our community of interest to try and do what we do better.
Yeah, maybe not necessarily about the ITU itself, but I think it's a really good blueprint of how civil society can influence multilateral processes. This also has to do with the WTO trade agenda that is ongoing, and that there's maybe room for some kind of influence, and many other multilateral processes. So I think that's the lesson learned. And I think to Jane's point, I think that it's useful to communicate or to share the good experiences that we had in engaging with governments and shaping their positions, because probably it's not possible to do it everywhere, but in many places it would be possible to do it. And there where it's possible, we should encourage and facilitate that groups have the capacity and the tools to develop better relations and shape governance positions as much as possible, if that's what they want to do, because again, understanding that for some groups it might not be possible, and for many other groups it might not be desirable to play the insider game, and that's totally fine.
Thanks so much, guys. We only have a few minutes left, so I want to see if Deborah or Mehwish has anything else that they wanted to add before we close up.
Thanks, Judith. This is Mehwish. I think going off of Gus's point, it's also important to see where Plenipot itself sits within the ITU ecosystem. The outcomes of the Plenipot, the resolutions that were newly established or modified as a result of this conference, it sets the agenda for the ITU over the next 4 years. And so while it's critical for civil society to continue working at these conferences to shape what that agenda looks like, we also need to go to the study group level to see where the rubber meets the road and to see where that agenda actually gets implemented in the standards and policy development grit. And so to answer your question in terms of where we then take these outcomes, I think we have to then channel our energies into strategizing at that study group level and looking at where we can start influencing the actual standards development that's happening or the policy development that's happening. And we're already starting to do that. I think even here, Jane and Deborah and I, we've all been talking about developing a joint, looking at possibilities for us to combine our efforts when it comes to the way spectrum is discussed at the ITU or the way that we engage in study group 1 of the ITUD. And so these conversations continue and we need to continue them in the context of the ITU.
Thanks so much, Mehwish. Deborah, do you have any closing thoughts before we end in a few minutes?
Sure, just briefly to add on to what others have said, which I agree with. I think just to take one step back even further to look at sort of where there's different developments on the issues we've been discussing at other UN, multilateral, or other processes. So we can't be everywhere at once, but we have to be aware that what's happening at the General Assembly or at the Human Rights Council or at the ITU are all linked in some way. So in WTO and other bodies. And it's quite resource intensive and a privilege to be able to participate in many of these spaces. So to the extent that we can, to share that knowledge and information, of course, different organizations come with different perspectives, sometimes different positions or priorities, but I think we have more in common than different. And the more that we can share that information and help map out and support one another in different spaces where we can, that will only make us stronger. So I'll stop there. I know we're almost at time.
Thanks so much, Deborah. Jane, do you have any closing thoughts? Okay, so if not, I do really appreciate all your thoughts and contributions and other things. If you missed the session, it will be on live again. Jolly, as his great talents, has it on archive. And he often, for people who couldn't watch things, restreams them again live so that if you missed it and you want a chance to ask questions to people who are joining a new live stream, which is just replay of it, you also have a chance. But Teresa's also here, and I wanted to give her, if you want a chance for any, thanks so much for all your hospitality here. And
sorry, first of all, sorry that I came late, but I'll watch the restream. I mean, Pavlina, I'm sure told you we are new to the building. We just moved in a week ago, and we are happy that the first event where we were involved is with you and ISOC. So thank you.
Thanks so much. And thanks again for coming in and giving us your thoughts and questions. And appreciate that we had a lot of good questions from the audience. Although I had prepared in advance some other questions, but it's always better to get audience questions. I know sometimes it takes a while for audience questions to materialize, but I'm glad we had these, and I'm glad we had this chance for having this chat and having this talk, because I think it's very important, and it's something that has been done, and we all looking within ISOC DC to get a broader audience and to get more civil society, get more other groups who are focusing on these interests involved within the work of ISOC DC. And so within our work, so we'd love for you to come back and join our other events, sign up, get on our mailing list, email Dustin to get on, and just so that we can get more views throughout, not only in Washington, D.C., but in outside in New York and other places. Or get involved with your local ISOC chapter. Always trying, if you want to start a new chapter, we're also always looking for new people, new groups, new states to sort of come up and help to spread the word about an open free and open outdoor internet. So with that, oh, okay. And just so that we can't be remiss of that, we have started or launching the IGF USA planning process for 2019. And so we want to make sure we have pre-events in as many different cities as possible to engage as many different views in the process on internet governance. And so it's going to be at the end of July, the 25th, July 25th here in DC, but hopefully we can have pre-events earlier or afterwards in there. And I do know that there is going to be, a lot of work goes on in trying to figure out how do we get more panels? How do we get more panels on civil society instead of a lot of the ones we have? And one of the main problems with that is that our panels are decided by what the survey done by people. So if we don't have as many people in civil society commenting on the topics, we are going to have less topics that may be focused to you. So that's why it's really important that when we release the survey, people comment on it and give their opinions.
Could we ask Dustin to give us an idea?
Dustin, will you tell about the process?
Yeah. So following on what Judith said, get involved soon. We don't just want involvement with the regional events, but also with the process as a whole. And all of our steering committee meetings have pretty solid remote participation opportunities. So you can participate from anywhere. So what we'll do is in mid-January, we'll convene our first steering committee meeting, and we'll open up a call for topics. We'll organize those topics and send it out in the form of a survey where we try to figure out what the community and the organizing committee see as top priorities for the 2019 discussion that we'll have on July 25th. So get involved early if there are particular issues that you'd like to see rise to the top, and if you'd like to shape the way that the conference looks this summer. So thank you.
Thanks again for coming, and thanks to everyone for their help. Thanks to sponsors, ISOC, Diplo, and ISOC DC. And we will see you online. And you missed the yummy pastries that we had here.
So it's a wrap.
So it's a wrap.
Okay.